Welcome to our channel. If you haven't subscribed yet, subscribe and activate the notification bell so you don't miss any of our spooky stories. It was a dense and cold night, like those where silence seems to whisper dark secrets. Carlos, a veteran bus driver, began his nighttime route through the deserted streets of the city. He always appreciated the serenity of the early morning hours, where darkness and solitude offered a kind of solace. But on that night, there was something different in the air. Something that made the hairs on his neck stand on end. The bus engine purred softly as he drove through the empty avenues. Everything seemed normal until a glimpse in the rearview mirror caught his attention. There, at the back of the bus, sitting alone, was a woman. Her skin was deathly pale, contrasting with the darkness around her. Her eyes, large and empty, seemed fixed on a distant point, or perhaps on a past that Carlos couldn't see. He frowned, trying to remember when she might have boarded. He didn't recall seeing her get on at any stop. Maybe he was tired and simply hadn't noticed. He continued driving, casting furtive glances in the rearview mirror. There was something about the woman's demeanor that unsettled him. She didn't seem to belong in that nighttime landscape. When the bus reached the final stop, Carlos prepared to get off and lock the doors. But when he looked back, the woman had disappeared. Confused and a little frightened, he walked through the empty aisles, searching for her. Every empty seat seemed to mock his sanity. There was no sign of her.
No trace, no clue.
Carlos returned to his seat, a sense of unease growing within him. It was just the beginning of his journey that night. Little did he know, it would be the first of many nights where he would encounter the inexplicable, the terrifying. The solitude of the night would never be the same again. Nights became longer and more disturbing for Carlos. Each new journey, the pale woman reappeared, always in the same place, always with the same vacant expression. Carlos felt a chill run down his spine every time his eyes met hers in the rearview mirror. There was something deeply unsettling about her silent presence. Intrigued and increasingly tormented, he began to pay closer attention. He watched the woman, trying to decipher any clue that could explain her constant appearance. Some nights he tried to talk to her, his voice echoing in the empty bus. Are you okay? Do you need help? But she never responded. She showed no reaction at all. She just sat there, motionless, like a sinister statue. Carlos' routine changed. He started arriving earlier to inspect the bus before starting the route. He checked every seat, every corner, hoping to find something that indicated the woman was real. But there was nothing. When the bus started moving, he inevitably saw her again, sitting there at the back, as if she were an integral part of the vehicle. His co-workers began to notice the change in Carlos. He was more reserved, more distracted. He told some of them about the woman, but they laughed, saying he needed a vacation, that he was imagining things. No one else saw the woman. To them, she was just a creation of Carlos' tired mind. One night, upon reaching the final stop, Carlos made a decision. He walked to the back of the bus, determined to confront the woman once and for all. His footsteps echoed in the empty vehicle, the sound amplified by the silence of the early morning hours. When he reached the seat where she always sat, he found only emptiness. The feeling of discomfort intensified. Carlos felt like he was being watched, even though there was no one there. Carlos' mind began to play tricks on him. Every shadow, every peripheral movement turned into the image of the woman. He was becoming obsessed, unable to distinguish between what was real and what was imaginary. Her constant, silent presence was becoming unbearable, and he knew he needed to uncover the truth behind this haunting. Little did he know, he was only beginning to unravel a mystery far darker than he could imagine. Carlos was on the verge of exhaustion, his nights filled with nightmares and his days haunted by memories of the silent woman. Determined to understand what was happening, he began searching for answers. He sifted through old company records, rummaged through yellowed newspapers, and asked questions of the more senior drivers. What he discovered was as disturbing as the woman's presence. On a particularly cold night, he found what he was looking for, a nearly forgotten news article in the yellowed pages of a local newspaper. A woman brutally murdered on late-night bus, the headline read. His heart raced as he read the details of the crime. A young woman named Maria had been attacked and killed while returning from work. The killer was never caught, and the case, without leads, had been closed. The bus where the crime occurred? The same one Carlos drove every early morning. With this revelation, everything began to make sense. The woman he saw night after night wasn't a figment of his imagination. She was Maria, or rather her spirit, trapped in that vehicle, perhaps seeking justice or peace. The relief of finally understanding what was happening was quickly replaced by the terror of knowing he was dealing with something supernatural. Carlos knew he had to do something, but what? He wasn't a detective, much less a ghost hunter. Still, the guilt of not having noticed Maria's torment sooner consumed him. He decided to learn more about her life, trying to find anything that could help her rest in peace. He visited the place where Maria had worked, talked to her former colleagues, and even found the few relatives still living in the city. He discovered that Maria was a kind person, loved by all, and that her death had left a deep mark on the community. No one had answers about who could have committed the crime, but Carlos felt he was getting closer to something important. Each new discovery made Maria's presence more intense. Now, in addition to seeing her, Carlos could hear whispers and feel a strange energy in the air. She was trying to communicate, he knew that much. But understanding what Maria wanted to say was a much more complex task. Carlos was determined. He would help Maria find peace, no matter how terrifying the path ahead might be. Carlos was determined to help Maria, but the reality of dealing with a haunted spirit was beyond anything he could have imagined. The nights became more intense and disturbing. Maria's presence was no longer just a silent figure at the back of the bus. She was a force that seemed to permeate the environment, turning each nighttime journey into a living nightmare. Early on in his route, the temperature inside the bus plummeted, causing his breath to form small clouds in the air. The wind outside howled, but inside the bus, everything was eerily silent. Carlos could feel Maria close to him, an oppressive, icy presence that made his heart race and his stomach churn. On one of the darkest nights, as he drove down a deserted street, he felt something touch his shoulder. It was a light touch, almost imperceptible, but enough to make his hands tremble on the steering wheel. He turned quickly, but as always, there was no one there. Only the echo of an indecipherable whisper in the air. Carlos tried to focus on the road, but the whispers continued, an unsettling melody that seemed to come from all sides. Lights flickered and objects began to move on their own. Once, the bus radio turned on by itself, emitting a static hiss that turned into fragmented words. Help me," the distorted voice said, find him." Carlos felt a shiver run down his spine. Maria was communicating somehow, and the urgency in her voice was clear. On an especially cold early morning, Carlos decided to confront Maria directly. He stopped the bus in the middle of a deserted street, turned off the engine, and stood up, walking slowly towards the back. The air around him felt heavier, each step echoing in the silence. Maria," he called out, his voice steady despite the fear he felt. I want to help you."
Tell me how. For a moment, there was complete silence.
Then, an ethereal figure began to materialize in the usual seat. Maria was there, clearer than ever, with an expression of deep despair. She reached out towards Carlos, and he, hesitant, took a step forward, reaching out to her. When their fingers almost touched, a wave of intense cold washed over Carlos, and he was overcome by a vision. He saw flashes of a rainy night, the interior of the bus bathed in blood, the killer's face obscured by shadows. The vision was brief and violent, leaving Carlos breathless. When he came to, Maria had disappeared, but her words echoed in his mind.
If find him, bring me peace.
Carlos knew he couldn't give up now. The connection between him and Maria was stronger, and he was more determined than ever to solve the mystery of her death. The bus continued to be his battleground, a place where the line between the world of the living and the dead became dangerously thin. The storm approaching that night was unlike any Carlos had ever seen. Black clouds gathered in the sky, thunder rumbled like war drums, and lightning illuminated the city with flashes of ghostly light. Carlos began his nighttime route with a heavy foreboding, as if the very air was charged with sinister electricity. He knew that night would be decisive. The bus moved slowly through the flooded streets, each movement feeling strangely autonomous, as if the vehicle had a will of its own. Carlos, already accustomed to strange phenomena, tried to maintain control, but something felt different. The rearview mirror showed Maria, clearer than ever, her eyes reflecting a deep pain and urgency he had never seen before. Suddenly, the bus headlights flickered and went out, plunging everything into almost total darkness. Carlos hit the brakes, but the bus didn't respond. Instead, it began to accelerate, as if driven by an invisible force. The steering wheel turned on its own, guiding the vehicle down an unknown path. Carlos struggled to regain control, but it was futile. The bus was possessed by an uncontrollable energy. As the bus sped through the deserted streets, Maria approached, moving to the front of the vehicle. She stopped beside Carlos, her face inches from his. Her eyes gleamed with supernatural intensity. Help me," as she whispered, her voice echoing in his mind. The end is near." The bus veered off the main road and onto a dirt path Carlos had never seen before. The trees around seemed to lean towards the vehicle, their branches stretching like skeletal arms trying to grab it. The storm was at its peak, rain hammering the bus roof and wind howling like a furious entity. Finally, the bus came to a sudden stop in front of an old abandoned mansion, its windows broken and walls covered in moss. Carlos felt his heart race in his chest. He knew that place held the key to Maria's mystery. With a deep breath, he opened the bus door and stepped out, the cold rain instantly soaking his clothes. Maria followed him, silently floating, guiding him to the mansion's entrance. The door creaked open, revealing a dark and decayed interior. Carlos entered, his footsteps echoing in the empty corridors. He felt that every shadow could conceal the killer, every sound could be a clue from the brutal past. In the center of the main hall, there was an old chair with marks of dried blood. Carlos felt a wave of despair as he approached. It was here that Maria had been taken after the attack, where her last breath had been drawn. Her presence intensified, and he felt a cold hand touch his shoulder. Suddenly, the vision came again, more vivid and detailed. He saw the killer's face, a man he recognized from police files, a man who was still free. Maria was showing him the truth, pleading for justice. Carlos knew what needed to be done. Carlos felt more determined than ever as the vision faded and Maria's presence slowly dissipated. He had the information he needed to finally bring peace to Maria's tormented spirit. But before leaving the mansion, he heard one last whisper, soft like the wind, "A thank you." With a heavy heart and a mind filled with disturbing images, Carlos knew he needed to act quickly. He returned to the bus, now with a clear purpose. Maria's presence had diminished, but he felt she was closer than ever, silently accompanying his every move with hope. His fate was intertwined with hers, and he was determined to unravel the mystery and bring justice. By dawn, Carlos was at the police station, speaking to a skeptical detective about the visions he had experienced. He presented the evidence he had gathered, the forgotten files of Maria's murder, and finally described the clear vision of the killer's face. The detective, initially reluctant, began to believe when Carlos mentioned details that had never been disclosed to the public. Something in the intensity of Carlos's eyes, the passion in his voice, convinced the detective to reopen the case. Over the following days, a discreet investigation was launched. Carlos followed every step, his anxiety mounting as the net closed around the suspect. He couldn't stop thinking about Maria, the ethereal figure who had shown him the way. Finally, on a cloudy afternoon, the police surrounded a house in the suburbs. The man Carlos had seen in his visions was taken into custody, bewildered and embittered. During interrogation, the man initially denied everything, but the pressure of the accumulating evidence and the almost palpable presence of impending justice made him relent. He confessed to the crime, describing details that only the true killer could know. Carlos, listening from the adjacent room, felt a mix of relief and sadness. The truth had been revealed, but the horror of what Maria had endured was now more real than ever. That night, Carlos returned to driving the bus. The city seemed quieter, as if an invisible weight had been lifted. He began his nighttime route, hoping to see Maria one last time. And she appeared, but this time, there was peace in her eyes. She sat in the same seat as always, but her demeanor was different, serene. When the bus reached the final stop, Maria stood up and walked to the door, something she had never done before. Carlos opened the door, and she looked at him with gratitude. Thank you," as she said, her voice a soft whisper, carried by the night wind. And then, like a sigh, she disappeared, dissolving into the darkness. Carlos stood there for a moment, looking at the emptiness where Maria had been. He felt a tear run down his face, but it wasn't sadness. It was relief, a sense of accomplishment. He knew that Maria was finally at peace, and with that, he also found some peace. The city was asleep, but for Carlos, a new journey had begun, one where he would never forget what he experienced on that nighttime route.